Hello, Bryce Tolpin here. I'm here today with Candace Lukasik. She's an assistant professor of religion and faculty affiliate in anthropology and Middle Eastern cultures at Mississippi State University. Hello, Professor Lukasik. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Uh,
Thank you so much for having me, Bryce.
Congratulations on your new book, Martyrs and Migrants, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading. I thought I might just sort of just for a moment about what it meant to me. The subtitle is Coptic Christians and the Persecution Politics of U.S. Empire. For me, it's an exploration of an Egyptian minority in the United States and a Christian minority in Egypt negotiating a national narrative here in the U.S. That's reverberating back into Egypt of a persecuted Christian, the persecuted Christians, but they're living in a far more complex, environment in their lives and in their communities. And Martyrs and Migrants demonstrates to me a rich approach to crossing religious and ethnic borders to allow readers to see your processing individual narrative, scholarship, breaking news almost in real time, especially when you're over in Egypt. Um, and it's helping me understand also what anthropology contributes to political theology as that conversation is unfolding in academia and in community organizing and other practices. So, anyway, congratulations. How would you describe the book yourself?
So the book, I would describe it as kind of broadly thinking about how this Middle Eastern Christian community, the largest remaining in the Middle East, Coptic Orthodox Christians, what has really migration done to this community, migration specifically to the West and specifically to the United States? What has it done to the community both there and here in the United States? So that's kind of the empirical question, but in kind of conducting that research, like with the community between rural Upper Egypt and overall the New York, New Jersey area of the United States, but also several other areas, including Nashville, Tennessee. Really, I wanted to think through um, what how Christianity transforms in terms of its political, theological, social transformations between its minority context in Egypt and its majoritarian context in the United States. Like, how do Copts kind of navigate these two religious and political dynamics? And obviously, the book, in its kind of central argument, tries to think through how being a religious minority in Egypt gets kind of transformed into a racial minority in the US context in terms of that recognition slash misrecognition in that kind of migratory pattern. So the book is really trying to contend with that as it speaks to broader kind of geopolitical conversations. And what I mean by geopolitical is American imperial conversations over the importance of defending Christians around the globe. So, conversations about international religious freedom. There was just the recent National Prayer Breakfast that happened that had a lot of different Middle Eastern Christian communities represented, including some in the Coptic diaspora, kind of speaking to how Copts are a part of this global initiative to defend Christians and to subsequently also defend international religious freedom. So the book is trying to contend with these different kind of scales that I see at its heart, and I hope that maybe we can kind of chat a little bit more about this. I see at its heart of being actually for Christians more broadly, and those that are interested in kind of political forms of Christianity or kind of the religious the kind of theological political elements of Christianity in the world today. What are kind of at base some really fundamental theological dilemmas within Christianity in and of itself? That's what the book at its heart is also really trying to think through.
So, what drew you to this kind of work? That is the work that you're doing among the cops that went into this book.
Yeah, and it kind of draws from my last answer, the last part of my answer a little bit, in that I went to Egypt when I was 17 years old for an Arabic language program, and at the time, um, I was a lapsed Catholic. I come from a Polish Catholic background in Buffalo, New York, originally, And I went to Egypt, interested in just seeing Egypt, but I, met a Coptic Christian family for the first time during that trip, and I obviously didn't even know that Christianity existed in Egypt as, somebody who grew up as an American Catholic or even just an American Christian more broadly, thinking about Christianity in the Middle East. This was also 2007, so Facebook was like just literally starting at that time. Um, so all this to say that my first kind of interest in thinking about basically like the in-betweenness of Middle Eastern Christianity and Middle Eastern Christians started with that encounter as like a Western Christian going to Egypt and discovering that there is this rich Christian tradition there, not just a Christian tradition, but maybe we could arguably say kind of the foundations of Christianity really laid there, both whether it be thinking about theology or monasticism or all of these central things to kind of Christian history and Christian theology. And so the book really is, for me, this book is the kind of culmination of over, I mean, nearly 2 decades of my own personal interest and reckoning of thinking about these dueling kind of Christian worlds between the Middle East and the United States, and how kind of Coptic Christians have been kind of, as Middle Eastern Christians, caught in between these various Christian traditions, perspectives, worldviews, however you want to kind of theologically frame it. Um, and so I myself, like over those years since 2007, have continually gone back to Egypt and really have seen a lot of kind of Coptic Christians there that I was very close with come to the United States. And so I really wanted to kind of understand what that migration has done to this tradition, the Coptic Orthodox tradition, and to this community more broadly. So it's both a personal kind of endeavor, as I think any anthropologist would probably say that like their interest in a particular context really derives from personal connections, interactions, or even their like who they are as well. And also just my connections with Coptic friends and family that I saw were being kind of transformed in migration.
Yeah, I could almost read between the lines, I think, about these developing relationships that you were making with particular families and friends over in Egypt as you'd come and go over years of the field work that went into this book. What was that field work like? I know that, one of the more dramatic references was, I think in 2017, you referred to, the bombing shootings, stabbings that happened. There was mass killing, I think, while you were there that talked about sort of the immediate responses that the Copts in the area you were in had. So what was living and traveling in Egypt like for you, in the days that you were there, as far as your own personal safety and as far as other things?
Yeah, so when I started field work, so obviously as anthropologists, like we develop like questions over several years, especially in the US, the American kind of academic context. Doing a PhD takes anywhere from, 5 to sometimes like 8 years. And so over that, yeah, over that amount of time, like we're doing coursework, but also like going and kind of following up on questions that we initially proposed, but like our developing context, right? So all of this to say in February of 2015, when ISIS affiliates in Libya beheaded 20 Copts and one Ghanaian man on the shores there of the Mediterranean, that garnered so much kind of obviously not just political attention, but religious and Christian attention around the globe. And um, so it was I was just finishing up my basically exams for my PhD and entering into field work when more attacks were happening against Coptic Christians in Egypt. In December of 2016, there was a bombing that took place at the cathedral area in Cairo, and dozens were killed. And it was at that time a few weeks later that I was beginning my fieldwork in Egypt. And the trip that I went on with a particular Coptic diaspora organization, many of them withdrew, the Coptic diaspora folks who just didn't feel safe going to Egypt, even though we were in a completely different area in southern Egypt. And that was the beginning of several other events that took place in 2017, including the dual bombings during Palm Sunday, both in Alexandria and in Tanta, that again killed dozens of people, and several other events that took place in 2017, um, including what I document in the book. When I go to the village that I worked in Bajura in Upper Egypt, when an attack happened on a bus of a number of pilgrims going to the St. Samuel, the Confessor Monastery. Um, all of these events were obviously received in Egypt and then in diaspora in very different ways. In the sense that in Egypt, obviously, it meant that, for example, like going to Bajura and seeing the day that this attack happened, which was not necessarily very close by to the village, but other monastery trips being canceled, a general sense of just deep fear and loss. Even though many didn't know, the people that were killed, but a sense of loss of, this could happen to my children or this could happen to me. And in diaspora, kind of the book goes back and forth between Egypt and the US. And that's what I did during that year is literally, I'd be several weeks at a time in Egypt and then go back to the US. And sometimes, in some cases, like in after the Palm Sunday bombings, I was going to Egypt the next day. I saw some people who were kind of impacted by those bombings going to Egypt at the same time. Uh, and in diaspora, the image of these forms of violence, the images of Coptic bodies, kind of part of them, like uh, put against the walls of, for example, the church in Tanta after the bombing, how those images affected whether it be kind of religious practice in the diaspora or vigils that took place, et cetera. Many of them were just forms of commemoration and connection to their brethren in Egypt. And in Egypt, how they were received was actually just immediate kind of change to life and threat to like uh, the disruption of everyday kind of religious practice, whether going to church and being in fear that even your local church could be a target, and this could be the beginning of subsequent bombings, versus in diaspora, kind of trying to connect and commemorate those victims. So, all of this to say that obviously there's a difference between these two contexts that connect them together in terms of transnational community formation, but each of these communities operate off of different conditions, is what I'm
Right,
saying. Yeah.
right. How do you sort of getting back to the field work that you do, and then bringing it back here? Obviously, that's important to write about, but you're sort of bringing that wealth of experience to your students. And I sort of when I met with you in the conference the part of the conference that you were heading up with the Political Theology Network this past fall, I was sort of taken with the amount of adventure that seemed quite palpable as I heard about all these anthropologists doing all this field work. Um, it's almost like I think of Indiana Jones, which was around when I was a kid, and his sort of, shedding of his tweed jacket in favor of his fedora, and suddenly he's out in the Middle East. Of course, he was not an anthropologist; he was an archaeologist, but or portrayed as one. How do you sort of pitch, anthropology to your students or your prospective students as something that they might wish to study?
Yeah, so I teach at Mississippi State University a class, the intro class to the study of religion. And I teach that class as an anthropology of religion class, and for the most part. And how I frame it to students is that we need to attend not to just everyday life. Like typically anthropologists will say, well, we attend to the everyday. and the messiness of the everyday, which we do. But I also think that as an anthropologist, we're attending almost to kind of the different scales and layers of a given context, like an event, like a bombing of a church. Like how do we get to that moment? How do different communities, even within the same community, like perceive the event? And how can we kind of attend to the ways in which we basically see the world around us? So let me give you kind of an example that I taught yesterday. And then I'll get to the point about kind of trading the tweed jacket for the fedora idea of the anthropologist, because I think that's an important one and one that I want to share, I guess, like my personal take on it. But yesterday, I was teaching on the idea that typically in the West, we understand religion is equaling belief. Like that's the central form of how we understand religion. And so how that comes from not only a very Protestant um, theological orientation to this idea of Christianity, but also religion. But how we can kind of attend to the ways in which both practice and context are really, in historical contexts and conditions, are important for how we even kind of think about religion in and of itself. So let me give you the example I gave yesterday of thinking about the context of the 21 martyrs of Libya. So we can think about obviously their witness of being beheaded on the shores of Libya for not giving up their faith in Jesus Christ. And that image has brought together various Christians around the world in seeing this modern day witness to Jesus Christ. But what is kind of left out is the context in which this happens, the various layers. And what are those layers? And this is what I spoke with my students about yesterday. The fact that these are Egyptian Christian migrants, from Egypt, laborers, very poor laborers who were basically forced to go to Libya to earn a living for their families in Upper Egypt because there's no other work. So they go to Libya, and as a minority Christian community, are not only vulnerable in terms of class, but also in terms of religious identity. And are even more vulnerable to the context that Libya was in at that time, which was very volatile and had numerous different kind of groups like ISIS that were kind of ruling different areas. And so we have to attend to not only how these migrants came to be in that situation, but also how those ISIS affiliates in filming their beheading saw them not just as these very poor migrants from Upper Egypt, but saw them as symbols to the West, essentially. Called them crusaders when one of the last crusades took place in Egypt that actually killed Christians in Egypt, right? Um, they were dressed them in orange jumpsuits, which was a index to the prisoners of Guantanamo Bay, of Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And so they became these symbols for the West, right? That ISIS wanted to convey. And so as in my classroom, we try to kind of attend to these different layers that lead these folks to become not only martyrs to the Coptic Church, but also symbols of this ideological civilizational battle between Islam and Christianity. And so that's what I think anthropology is able to do is actually attend to messiness and not just apply theories onto given case studies. And so that's what I kind of pitch to students is really that anthropology allows us to attend to the messiness of the world. And so just to speak to the idea of the anthropologist between the corduroy jacket or the suit jacket and the fedora, let's say between the university and the quote unquote field. I will say that I hope that my perspective is a little bit unique in that so as I mentioned earlier, when I first went to Egypt, and I interacted with a Coptic Orthodox family, it wasn't just kind of a sociological interaction. It became a very deep spiritual one for me, so much so that a few years later, I was baptized and became Coptic Orthodox myself being Catholic, growing up Polish Catholic in Buffalo. Um, and so my interactions with with Coptic Orthodox folks both in Egypt and the US is not just kind of, I don't see it just as an intellectual one. It's very much like a part of my own kind of spiritual journey. And so I don't know if I necessarily go between suit jacket and fedora. So much so as I think of these both of these geographies as almost on the same terrain for me. Um, in that Egypt is just as much of my home, I feel, as where I am in Starkville, Mississippi.
How might your work fit in with books that focus on, like Palestinian Christians and their suffering, not at the hands of Palestinian Muslims, but at the hands of Israel and indirectly at the hands of Christian Zionists? I mean, similar themes. I mean, I think perhaps the Christians there don't have quite the muscle with respect to the American empire, to kind of fend off some of the effects of it. But, they're championed, perhaps if they're noticed at all by, say, the evangelical West, but they're also handed this terrible deal because the Zionism, the Christian Zionism is sort of helping Israel sort of smother them, like in Bethlehem and places. Um, Long question, but how does it fit in with the larger, sort of Levantine narrative there?
Palestinian Christians, uh, I don't think kind of are able to fit into this idea that I discuss in the book in Martyrs and Migrants on the economy of blood. And I'm sure that we can talk a little bit more about that, but the economy of blood that I kind of lay out is essentially um, twofold. It goes between kind of thinking about Coptic Christians and other Middle Eastern Christians as persecuted kin, just like American Christian conservatives understand Christianity in the US is under threat. And so they see Christians in the Middle East as also under threat by Islam in that context. And so they are one Christian kind of body together, whereas they're also racialized others in the US context. But I think, and I argue that I don't see that Palestinian Christians can even be included in the kinship aspect of the economy of blood for the reasons that you just outline, in that obviously within Christian Zionism, Judaism and Israel overall has a very particular theological importance that actually, and I don't say this ironically, but actually supersedes the Christian communities that remain in Palestine. Um, and so those Christian communities end up being exceptions to, in terms of their presence, to the vast majority of Islamic or Muslim extremists that are in Palestine. That Palestine is equated to being a Muslim context, even though this is the obviously the birthplace of the Christian tradition. And so, because of these narratives about Palestine as equaling Islam, or in probably the most blunt case, as equaling Hamas, for example, or just Islamic extremists more broadly, that narrative is obviously played through, whether it be Western media or think tanks or even academic contexts, that actually just doesn't allow for people to see Palestinian Christians at all within the Middle Eastern Christian context. And so I don't think that it's even possible for them to be included within the economy of blood that I lay out, in terms of glorifying them as an ancient Christian community, or kind of glorifying, even, let's say, if, and there have been obviously many Palestinian Christians who have been killed at the hands of the Israeli state, and whether in Gaza in the past several years, or in the context of the West Bank. And those Christians are not seen, Palestinian Christians are not seen as martyrs.
Yeah,
Why is that?
right.
That's
Yeah.
the question, I guess.
That visibility aspect that you said, I don't know if it's a cause or an effect. It sounds like it's almost like a way of like a heuristic, like how visible are they to the general public through media, through, you know, other means of attention getting. Um, and the speaking of heuristic, your economy of blood, I thought was a fascinating concept, a lens through which to view the Coptic experience both in Egypt and here. Could you speak a little bit more about, the economy of blood and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll obviously give you the kind of political lens through it, but theologically, it really, as I noted at the beginning of our conversation, gets to one of, I think, the central paradoxes within Christianity, and that is that um, a twofold. When we think about martyrs, when we think about the importance of martyrs within Christian history and until the present day, we think about how they are connected to the central kind of focus of Christian theology, which is obviously Christ on the cross and his resurrection. And so they are, as martyrs, becoming one with Christ in that moment. Um, and so, in thinking about Coptic martyrs or other Middle Eastern Christian martyrs as being kind of visible in some sense, they become kind of the examples of Christ on the cross in this present moment. But it's their visibility and the non-visibility of others like Palestinian Christians that is part of why I'm noting the economy of blood as an economy, meaning that there are ways in which certain things circulate and other things do not circulate, in terms of imagery, in terms of like what deaths become martyrdom and what deaths remain simply just death in terms of the kind of global Christian tradition. Um, and so the economy of blood, kind of more broadly, as I noted earlier, is this dueling figure between within Christianity between those that are inside of the body, that are part of the capital B body of Christ, and those that are outside of the body. And throughout Christian history, this has taken on various different lenses in terms of those outside of the body, whether it be thinking about uh, you know Jewish converts to Christianity in the Iberian Peninsula and determining who is really a Christian and who is still a Jew, or whether it be in the context that I lay out in the book of those Middle Eastern Christians who come to the United States who are seen as terrorists, even though they say that they're Christian, but they are seen as terrorists, have counterterrorism files opened up on them, even though they say I'm from Egypt, I'm a Christian. So it's about, again, this uh, uh, visibility uh, that I would say is the kind of political aspect of the economy of blood. But the theological contradictions within the economy of blood are really about who is a part of the Christian body and who is not. Meaning, if you are a Christian, who is my community and who is not? Who is worthy of my attention and my reverence, and who is not? And I think this is a central question beyond the context that I lay out in Martyrs and Migrants, with thinking about Middle Eastern Christianity, when we see what is happening, at least in the US context, with immigration enforcement and the idea that many of those Coptic migrants to the United States are not just racialized in terms of the war on terror, but they're also racialized in terms of the current immigration crackdown, and many of them languishing in ICE detention facilities throughout the United States, whether it be in Louisiana or even in New York and New Jersey. And so how do they become both these revered martyrs, but also these racialized migrants, along with other Catholics and other Protestants that are from Latin America, et cetera?
I was very much taken with two chapters in your book that dealt with two specific um, issues that come up. One is just, getting the asylum, getting the green card, and your conversation with with a lawyer that's very much involved in that. And then another chapter involving the cops becoming policemen, particular police women in New York City, particularly, and how that, arguably benefits the community. I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit, into what asylum and that whole process sort of demonstrates about the Coptic experience here, as well as their understanding of their role that they might have with the police.
Yes, I think both of these topics are um, obviously very sensitive in this current moment and very important for how we think about what being Middle Eastern Christian or what being specifically Coptic is in the United States today. Um, when I talk about asylum in the book, obviously the majority of folks that are coming from Egypt are either coming through family reunification or the green card lottery, as I talk about in the book. So those that are coming through asylum, and this has varied over the years, obviously, given over the past, like let's say decade, because given administration changes and things like that. But at the time that I was doing my fieldwork in 2017, 2018, many cops, and even thereafter, many cops, were coming and obviously uh, filing for asylum. And some of those cases that ended up going to trial, the conversations that happened on the stand that I document in the book really focus not only on identifying them as Christians, but most importantly on making sure this particular narrative of all Muslims and at times this was in certain dialogue, all Muslims and particularly Islamist organizations are targeting all Christians in Egypt. So it was really specific to again reinforcing this what I would say civilizational, geopolitical narrative of Islam versus Christianity.
It was almost
That
as
that
yeah, reading it was it's almost like the less information you give, the better. Just sort of hit the
yes.
high notes and don't worry about your own story, because the more they get into that, the more, the less they'll be attracted to sort of the main narrative,
Yes.
that the lawyer knows the judge wants to hear. So
Yes. I mean, it's so this is not so in framing it this way, it's not to say that like how to put this mildly. Um, Obviously, any legal system operates within certain regulations, parameters, certain discourses, certain logics that you must follow in order to be legible to the system. And so, when when the lawyer I was working with, and obviously the Coptic clients are answering these questions, they're answering them because that's what the system demands. That's what the system demands of them to show violence, to make it indisputable that if they return to Egypt, they will be harmed. There's no messiness. So this is beyond what I talked about with anthropology. There can be no messiness. It must be black and white in the context of the legal system. And so obviously asylum seekers have to transform in some ways like their personal stories of discrimination that they've experienced in Egypt and other forms of violence. Quite frankly, it's not as if they're coming up with these stories out of nowhere, but they have to make sure that they are black and white to typically, at least the judges that I interacted with, white, older American, both men and women judges. They need to be able to understand, I know who the cops are. I know that they are persecuted, and I know that I have to grant that this case.
and you're thinking that, and they're also well indoctrinated in the Christian persecution narrative that plays out a lot in our country. That they're, yeah.
Absolutely. But I want to take note that so this doesn't operate the same for, and I think I may note this in a I believe I note this in a footnote, but very briefly. But it's not as if all Middle Eastern Christians have the same legibility within the legal system. And what I mean by that is um, The same lawyer obviously had both Coptic clients and some Iraqi Christian clients. Those Iraqi Christian clients did not have the same level of legibility that Coptic clients did. So again, it's about the visibility of especially what happened in February of 2015 of the martyrs of Libya and media attention on incidents of bombings and violence, et cetera, that makes Egypt a very black and white case between Christianity and Islam that is easily translatable to a US legal system.
And on the side of on the issue of the police, it sounded like
Yes.
a number of the immigrants to the U.S. from Egypt, the Copts, were attracted to the idea that, if we're part of the system, we're going to, well, maybe you can explain. What were the some of it sounded profound to me. Some of these ways that they thought about, we really need to be part of this system that sort of oversees us. But what were they thinking when they were and still are, becoming members of the of police forces?
Yeah, and I think about so more broadly that particular chapter, just so your audience kind of has a flavor of what is discussed. Um, so after 9/11, the New York, New Jersey area, there there were a lot of Coptic people who either became part of the NYPD, and for those that don't remember, obviously the NYPD had this mapping program of New York, and it did stretch illegally into New Jersey, of basically mapping ancestries of origin that were of concern, and Egypt being one on the list. And there were also two exceptions to these ancestries of interest that included actually Coptic Christians and Iranian Jews. But again, in places that, for those that know New York well, there are some certain places where you can't. I mean, maybe if you asked or looked very intently, there are Egyptian Christians and Muslims that interact with each other in certain highly specifically kind of Egyptian spaces in New York. And so the NYPD had this mapping program, and a lot of cops after 9/11 wanted to join the police force in order to, in some ways, and this is what that chapter talks about, to make sure that there was, people on the force that could say, like, what is the difference between the Coptic community here and the Egyptian Muslim community here, or these other Muslim communities? Like, how basically to have people on the force to make recognition possible, to say how cops are different than these other suspicious groups. And that has produced, some internal issues within the NYPD, so much so that while there was a Turkic and Middle Eastern, there is kind of a union within the police force, not like an official, but basically kind of a community together, that Middle Eastern Christians and especially Copts did not see themselves reflected within this community because of religious difference. And so they formed their own kind of community or union because of that. And were able to kind of see their kinship, their Christian kinship with other Christians on the police force in a unique way beyond their kind of geographic, specificity, being from like the Middle East. So you have folks that are joining the NYPD. You had folks post 9/11 that are joining the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the NYPD. You have people that are joining the FBI, et cetera, that are really in some ways trying to give better information of, how cops are different than Muslims, quite frankly, right? And so I frame that in the chapter not as a these cops are trying to, it's partially that, but these cops are not trying to become white in some way, or like become to become part of whiteness. It is that, but it's more of a way in which they could become a part of a system in which cops are not differentiated or seen as others,
Right.
and therefore the targets of securitization.
And there's that
And
that reference to the Irish, I think you mentioned,
yes,
and how much they bought into becoming policemen in places like New York, in order to become more legible and to not be, typecast so quickly by law enforcement.
yeah, Absolutely. And that was where the chapter ends, is this conversation or the speech that Patrick Lynch, the former head of the Benevolent Society, the NYPD's Benevolent Society, um, where he says, like, we as Irish came here persecuted, and just like you are persecuted. And so there was this shared language of persecution, even in that particular banquet that occurred between Coptic members of the NYPD and other members of the NYPD. So this is just all to say that you know policing is a part, and policing and being able to be a part of the processes of differentiation of dangerous others, or others that are a threat, is an important part of quite frankly becoming American.
There's this wonderful sense that you give in the book that the Copts really in their villages um, don't face these overarching narratives, or have at least enough communication with their their fellow citizens who are Muslim, so that some of these things don't play out in the smaller villages. And I was just thinking about that and some of the other dynamics that the um, how the Egyptian government under Nasser and then under Sadat began to look to the church as the spokesman for the Copts in order to reduce the power of the Coptic landed aristocracy, and then under Sadat to alleviate the state's social welfare responsibilities. But in moving to Nashville, and your what you discussed there, it's almost like that. The
Mm.
Metropolitan Nashville government looks to the Coptic churches as they're linked to the city's Coptic population, and that's sort of an incomplete assumption on their part, you know. And maybe you could speak to that last part of your book where you discuss what's going on in Nashville there a bit in that respect.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because you almost frame it in a very in a different way, I think, than most, in the sense that in Egypt, of course, there is this broader conversation about how the church becomes this political, social, cultural religious representative of all Copts in Egypt. And in almost like a parallel sense, you're right, in places like Nashville and elsewhere, the church also takes on this political, social, cultural, in some cases legal role, as I noted in the asylum chapter, of the church, saying who is a Coptic Christian and who is not, for these cases. Um, and so there's almost this kind of parallel dynamic happening here too in the US context, where the church tends to also take on this spokesperson role. Um, to the US government. And that lends itself to some at times problematic dynamics, in the sense that when you have the church as a institution, obviously wanting to make sure that it maintains its political, social role within American society, it has its legitimacy, it tends to obviously want to play to the broader politics of it, the geography it's a part of. So in the context of Nashville and in the South more broadly, obviously, this is more conservative Republican territory. And obviously many churches across the United States, not all, also, have a more conservative political approach. So it's not out of, left field for them to kind of see a type of kinship, also part of the economy of blood that I talked about. But that tends to also, at times, especially given the social, economic perspectives of most conservatives and most Republicans in the United States, tends to leave out what, in the case of Nashville, are many poor and working class cops and their needs, and their perspectives that tend to at times, of course, socially cohere with Republican and more conservative values, but economically do not, in the sense that they have, stronger social and economic needs that the church does not necessarily promote, or at times even support, remotely support. And so for an organization like the Al Mahabba Center, one of the things that I find to be honestly so admirable and something that I really just admire and love about the center is its focus on working class Coptic Christians, Coptic Christian migrants in Nashville. And I think that the message that it puts both on social media and within the broader Nashville community is that we will help in a way that at times the Coptic Church, and not just at times, at many times does not support, whether it be through dispersing like diapers for new mothers, young mothers, um, whether it be through just like helping students navigate college admissions or just the needs of new migrants that don't understand the American system as readily and that don't see the church kind of meeting those needs. Again, this is not all churches. I will say that in New York, New Jersey, particularly the church that I worked with in New Jersey, they did a lot of work for new migrants directly and wouldn't necessarily put this on the diocesan level, but because there were so many Coptic new migrants and very poor migrants from areas of Upper Egypt, they had to do something, finding jobs, apartments, etc. Um, but that's not everywhere. And in a place like Nashville, the Al-Mahabba Center has been able to um, highlight really the needs of those working class Coptic Christians that the church has not been able to do.
Yeah, I think they sort of the story that you tell in the book was fascinating of how, so many of the Copts new to the country, new to the US, came down to Nashville to, help build out the next phase of Opryland, as I recall. And the churches seemed ill prepared for that. And it seems like Lydia Yusuf, whom you mentioned in the book, and El Mahaba really filled in the gap there, that the church wasn't meeting in the cases of these lower class Coptic people.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about just to note, just thinking about, and I talk about this in the conclusion of what happened during COVID, and many Coptic working class folks in Nashville, like working in factories like Tyson Foods, et cetera, that were um, not only not protected by those companies, but also the Coptic Church didn't allow for them to advocate for themselves in terms of forming unions, in terms of forming other coalitions with other migrant communities that uh, happen to be Muslim, for example, right? So I appreciate what the Al Mahabba Center is doing in really focusing on kind of in some ways like shared working class interests that disrupt the how can I say it, neoliberal focus of the body of Christ being um, the sole perspective to think through. But how do we think about kind of our broader community and bringing together like different perspectives on social conditions, economic conditions, to form kind of just a better community together.
Thank you so much,
Yours.
Professor Lukasik, for all your time and expertise and insight. And thank you so much for writing the book as well.
No, thank you so much for having me on. And this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate it.